To start us off in ecology, we're going to be looking at energy and how energy moves through environments. Okay. Before we do that, we're going to go back to unit 3, though, and we're going to revisit some terms. Now, don't worry, we're not going to get back into the nitty gritty of cellular respiration or photosynthesis, but there are some terms that we learned there that are going to come back and be important here in unit 8. Okay. So let's just revisit them for a quick second. Remember, we learned in unit 3 that there are these things called autotrophs, and they are what we call self feeders because they're able to take energy from their environment and like turn it into energy that they can use. And they don't need to eat anything. Okay, they feed themselves. So, obviously, in unit 3, we talked a whole lot about photosynthesis and how some organisms are able to catch sunlight and turn that into energy. Okay, and examples of this would be like plants, bacteria, algae, that good stuff, okay? Um, Photosynthesis is not the only way that you can be a self-feeder. You can also do what's called chemosynthesis, and that is instead of taking sunlight and converting it into energy, you take carbon molecules, typically, and convert it into energy. So this is done by organisms that live in oxygen-free environments. So most commonly found at like the bottom of the ocean in the deep sea vents. These are giant tube worms that have chemosynthetic bacteria inside of them. Okay. And so they take the carbon molecules in the ocean water and convert it into energy because they're not getting sunlight at the bottom of the ocean. It's dark. Okay. So either by doing chemosynthesis or by doing photosynthesis, these are ways you could be a self feeder. Okay. Our other category then is heterotrophs, and heterotrophs cannot make their own food. So the way that they get energy is they have to eat something, right? So that's how they get their energy. This would be us, right? We're consumers. So you can consume plants, animals, both. It doesn't matter. As soon as you're consuming or depending on something else to get your energy, you are a heterotroph. So even like fungi, which are decomposers, they are essentially kind of like quote unquote eat rotting things. That's how it breaks it down, right? So it eats plants or animals that are decaying, and without it, it wouldn't survive. So those would be our heterotrophs. All right. So that's kind of the vocab we needed to revisit. And so now we're going to jump on into applying this to ecology and ecosystems. Okay. So when we're looking at how energy flows through the ecosystem, mostly it's going to start with the sun because, again, like, the bottom of the ocean is a very specific thing, but the rest of the earth is kind of depending on sunlight and those plants. And then it's going to kind of like move up the food chain. All right. And hopefully you all are familiar with food chains. Chains can be drawn like linearly, like the grasshopper eats the plants, and this little rodent eats the grasshoppers, and this hawk eats the rodent. And notice the direction that the arrows are pointing. It points to like what eats it. Okay. Sometimes they're drawn in a straight chain. Sometimes they're drawn in more of a web because typically it's not just like a line. There's maybe multiple things that eat the grasshopper, right? So it can be a chain or a web. And notice these levels here are called trophic levels. And basically, that's just kind of showing how far removed things are from the plants. So a level 1 is going to be a producer, and a level 2 is going to be a thing that eats a plant, essentially. And a level 3 is going to be a thing that eats a thing that eats a plant, and so on. Okay. So again, plants here are going to be the first level of all of our food chains that we're looking at. You don't see it going all the way up to level 10 or anything because of the inefficiency of energy transfer. We'll talk about that on the next slide. But you typically only see 4 or 5 levels. And in some way, shape, or form, it will all connect to decomposers because, if this hawk eats this guy, great. Um, that body will be digested by this guy. But then at some point in time, this hawk is going to die. And if nothing eats the hawk, then its body is just going to like be there on the ground. And what gets rid of it? Decomposers, right? So eventually, either directly or indirectly, it all ties back to decomposers. Now, I talked about how there's very inefficient energy transfer, and let's take a look at that. So if you look at um, an ecosystem, if you look at the amount of sunlight that's available, only 1% of that gets converted into actual usable energy by the plants. Okay. And then when something eats a plant, it gets 10% of that energy. And when something eats that something, it gets 10% of that energy. And when something eats something, it gets 10%. So, like, the most common rule is the rule of 10%, that of roughly 10% of energy is lost between trophic levels here, right? Because the sunlight isn't technically part of the trophic levels. Um, but like, why? Where does it all go? Well, maybe you remember with cellular respiration that it's actually pretty inefficient, that a lot of that energy does not get actually converted into physical usable energy. So a lot of energy is lost to cellular respiration. It's lost to waste. It's lost to things like heat escaping from the body, right? All these things are inefficiencies where we can't actually convert all the energy we consume into usable energy. So this is why at some point in time you can't keep having more and more predators on top, because there would just be very little energy that they're actually getting. Okay. Which makes you think, as humans, right? Like, how much energy does it take to feed us? And so if you're a vegetarian, it takes less energy because you're more directly eating the plant source versus, meat eaters. And I'm not knocking meat eaters, but, this is something to be knowledgeable about as a meat eater. Like, the eco footprint is another story as well. But just knowing that energy wise, it's less efficient to be a meat eater than it is to be a vegetarian. All right. So speaking of energy and like what we eat, how does that whole thing work? You're probably aware of this, but if you take in more energy than you expel, this is going to cause you to grow or to store energy. Okay. So, AKA like weight gain. And that's not always a bad thing. Like, if you're a squirrel getting ready for winter, you want to gain weight, right? That you're going to need that. And on the flip side, if you expend more energy than you consume, that means that you will lose mass. Okay. And again, if you're a squirrel that's fattened up for winter, that's okay for a while. But at a certain point of time, if you lose too much mass, it's going to end up, your body's going to have to turn to burning your own tissues like muscles and organs. And that's going to be bad and could lead to death. It's like a car running out of gas. Okay. So if what you eat is what you are burning, then your weight is not changing or you're not growing, but you need an energy surplus in order to grow or store. Okay. And you need an energy like deficiency to go down. And again, just to be clear, weight loss is not always good. Okay. Oftentimes it can be not good. Not saying that at all, just FYI. Um, and one thing to consider is that actually when animals are looking to reproduce, or plants, it actually takes a whole lot of energy to build the sperm, to build the egg or the pollen and the ovule and all these things. And so to make the cells takes energy. And then also, if it's a thing where then that baby or egg is growing inside, there's energy expended to like get that thing to birth. And so when you think about it, it's pretty energy costly to have offspring. And also think about like what time of year animals usually reproduce in, and why might that be? Right? Usually spring or summer, right? This is for a couple reasons. You're going to need food. You're going to need food to reproduce. You're going to need food to feed those babies. And when is there lots of food? Spring and summer, right? Plus, it typically takes a lot more energy to keep yourself warm if you're in cold weather, right? So the milder temps is like a much more forgiving environment for the fresh little babies. And so if you're going to expend that energy, they have a better chance of surviving in the spring and summer, right? So basically, why do we need energy? Because we're trying to like keep our bodies as they are, we're trying to grow, or we're trying to reproduce. Okay. As far as heat stuff goes, there's kind of different strategies that organisms can use to regulate their body temperature. Endotherms, like us, are going to regulate our own internal body temperature so that more or less stays very, very constant in a small range. And this is basically by our own metabolism, basically by our own cellular respiration is producing heat, and we use that heat, we trap it in pretty well to keep our body temps constant. Ectotherms, though, we refer to those things sometimes as quote cold blooded, although they're not. They don't really quite have those mechanisms built in as well. And so they're going to use their environment to help that. So they could move into the sun if they're cold, or move into the shade if they're hot, or they can group up with individuals. This is a pile of marine iguanas in the Galapagos. And when they come out of the cold water, they'll get on these dark volcanic rocks to bask in the sun, and then they will literally pile on top of each other so that their like combined body heat helps warm each other up. Okay, little fun thing. Here's an interesting question. Once you think about which one has a higher metabolic rate, an elephant or a mouse? What do you think? Now, obviously, an elephant is huge, right? So the amount of energy an elephant's going to go through is going to be massive. There's no way it could compare to a mouse. But if we take into consideration their body size and like energy per gram, the mouse has a way higher metabolic rate than an elephant. And this holds true basically for the endotherms. The smaller mass, the higher its metabolic rate is going to be. And why this is, we kind of know a little bit, but not fully. Some of this has to do with surface area to volume ratio. Remember, ding, 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 back when we talked about that with cell sizes and why cells can't get too big. This little guy has a much bigger surface area to volume ratio, so his body heat's going to escape him easier than this elephant. So that's part of it, but it doesn't fully explain it. So it's a thing that scientists are still figuring out, which is kind of cool. As always, here are some things to consider, things you should know after watching this lecture. And here is where we are in the textbook.